generally have bilateral lesions of the superior temporal lobe, though some have unilateral lesions, in all but one case, have been localized to the left hemisphere. Griffiths et al. 1999, Peppel 2001. The bilateral lesions suggest that both hemispheres are involved in extracting phonetic cues to speech. From Straw et al. 1991. The unilateral lesions have also been argued to be consistent with bilateral processing, as these lesions typically include deep subcortical structures and thus could damage both phonetic processing on the left and disconnect the results of such processing on the right from lexical phonological representations on the left. Fishwind 1965. Takahashi et al. 1992. Peppel 2001. According to the model in Figure 1, phonetic cues are mapped onto phonemes. Some researchers have argued, however, that phonetic features are mapped directly onto lexical representations, and thus a phonemic level is not needed. Marsland, Wilson, and Warren 1994. In fact, it appears that no cases have been reported that show the pattern predicted from a deficit to the phonemic level, that is, impaired vowel and consonant perception, but preserved perception of non-speech stimuli with acoustic features similar to those in speech. In contrast to the lack of evidence for a phonemic level, there is evidence supporting a lexical phonological level separate from semantics. That is, some patients have been reported who show preserved phoneme discrimination and identification, but impaired performance on spoken word recognition tasks, tapping lexical and semantic levels, such as auditory lexical decision and synonymy judgment. Howard and Franklin 1988, Martin and Safran 1992, Hillis et al. 1999. As with the pure word deaf patients, these patients show much better semantic processing for written words, again, ruling out a semantic deficit for SA. All of these cases have had unilateral left hemisphere damage. For all, the damage included temporal or parietal regions, but for two the damage was quite widespread and included other left hemisphere regions. Howard and Franklin 1988, Hillis et al. 1999. Other patients show a preservation of lexical phonological information, but disrupt access from this information to semantics. Hall and Ritta, 1997, reported a particularly striking example of this pattern. Their patient, KW, with a left parietal. Anu. Reverend Cycall, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5, 2002, 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM Latex 2E, January 18, 2002, P1, IBC. Language and the Brain 61. Lesion performed well on auditory and written lexical decisions. On semantic tasks, he performed very poorly with auditory presentation, but was within the normal range with written presentation. Franklin et al., 1994, 1996, and Cohn and Friedman, 1986, have reported similar cases. Two of these, Franklin et al. 1994, 1996, were reported to have left middle cerebral artery infarcts, which could implicate frontal, parietal, and temporal regions. The case of Cohn and Friedman had damage to Wernicke's area. In some, patients with damage either to lexical phonological representations or to the connections between these representations and semantics all have left hemisphere damage, with temporal or parietal regions most often involved. Thus, whereas phonetic feature extraction may be carried out bilaterally, the results of this feature analysis appear to be mapped onto lexical phonological representations in the posterior left hemisphere, which then provide access to semantic repression. Cations. Consistent with this conclusion are findings from a study by Hillis et al. 2001, which examined the effects of reperfusion of the left superior temporal lobe in 6 stroke patients who had word comprehension difficulties and showed hypoperfusion of this region. Using a pharmacological agent to increase blood pressure, they demonstrated increases in word comprehension that were directly related to the extent of reperfusion of this region as measured through magnetic resonance perfusion-weighted imaging. Contrary to the tenets of the traditional Wernicke-Lithium model, some findings from lesion studies suggest a role for the frontal lobes, specifically Broca's area, in speech perception. Bloomstein 1998, 2001, Martin et al. 1999a. Bloomstein, 1998, reviewed studies showing that aphasic patients of all clinical categories, including Broca's aphasics, have speech perception deficits when tested on phoneme and word discrimination and identification. Functional neuroimaging of Neuralink. Intact individuals have also implicated a role for frontal regions in speech percept. Tie-in, see neuroimaging section for discussion. neuroimaging studies, the findings from neuroimaging studies are consistent with the lesion data with regard to bilateral temporal lobe involvement in the extraction of phonetic cues from speech. When passive listening to speech sounds has been compared with rest or listening to simple auditory signals like tones, bilateral superior temporal lobe activation has been obtained, e.g., Peterson et al. 1988, Sator et al. 1992, Binder et al. 1994, 1996, 1997, see Cabeza and Nyberg 2000 for an overview. Left lateralized activation would be predicted for phonological processing beyond the level of phonetic feature extraction. In order to reveal such processing, speech stimuli need to be compared to a control condition or conditions that employ stimuli with acoustic features like those in speech. The results of such studies have varied depending on the nature of the control condition and the subject's task. Some studies have contrasted an active speech task, such as phoneme monitoring, with passive listening to speech, Sator et al. 1992, Peppel et al. 1996. Others have contrasted two active listening conditions in which attention. Anu. Reverend Psychol, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5th, 2002, 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM Latex 2E, January 18, 2002, P1, IBC. 62 Martin. Is directed either towards phonological or semantic properties of speech stimuli, D. Eminent et al. 1992, 1994. More left lateralized activation is obtained in active conditions. The interpretation of such findings is open to debate, however, as some argue that passive listening or performing a semantic task automatically activates all regions normally engaged in speech processing, and thus, such subtractions would have eliminated relevant cortical areas, Norris and Wise 2000, leaving only task or strategy-specific activation. Others argue, however, that performing an active task simply boosts activation in the most critical regions because attention is directed to speech-specific processing, Fees et al. 1995. Other studies have compared passive listening to speech to passive listening to stimuli with speech-like features, e.g., Binder et al. 2000, Howard et al. 1992. Binder et al. 2000 contrasted the activation resulting from passive listening to words, pseudo-words, e.g., split, reversed words, i.e., recorded speech played, backwards, tones, and noise. No areas were found to be more activated in the word condition than the pseudo-word or reversed word conditions. All three stimuli produced greater activation bilaterally in the mid-superior temporal gyrus and adjacent superior temporal sulcus than the non-speech stimuli. There was only weak evidence of more extensive activation in the left than right hemisphere for the speech stimuli. Wise and colleagues, Scott et al. 2000, Wise et al. 2001, however, have suggested that considerable lexical activation may arise from processing pseudo-words, see Gaskell and Marsland-Wilson 1997, McClelland and Ellman 1986, or even reversed words, as subjects can identify a fairly large proportion of phonemes in reversed speech, Binder et al. 2000. Scott et al. 2000 used as stimuli spoken sentences and altered versions of these sentences that varied in intelligibility and the presence of phonetic features. They reported a region of the left superior temporal sulcus that responded more to the conditions with phonetic information, whether or not they were intelligible, and also found that an anterior portion of this sulcus responded only to intelligible speech. The interpretation of the role of this more anterior region is unclear, however, as the intelligible sentences engage sentential semantic and syntactic processes in addition to lexical processes. Activation in frontal regions has also been uncovered in neuroimaging studies of speech perception. Price et al. 1996 reported a complex relation between task factors and inferior frontal activation, Rodman's area, VA 45. During speech perception, e.g., the activation was greater for slower rates of presentation of the words. Frontal areas are routine activated, however, when the NeuroImag ING study employs a speech perception task that involves active manipulation of phonological information, such as phoneme monitoring or phoneme discrimination. E.g., D. Eminent et al. 1992, 1994, Sator et al. 1992, Burton et al. 2000 showed that in two closely matched syllable discrimination tasks, inferior frontal activa tie-in was obtained only when the task required segmentation of the initial phoneme from the remainder of the syllable. As Norris and Wise, 2000, have pointed out, tasks that require phonemic segmentation cannot be performed by illiterate individuals, yet these individuals have no difficulty perceiving speech. The The process of learning letter-sound correspondences during reading acquisition may foster an Anu. Reverend Cycall, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5, 2002. 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM latex 2E. January 18, 2002. P1 IBC. Language and the Brain 63. Awareness of sublexical phonological representations typically involved in speech output rather than speech perception. Using a task in a neuroimaging study that requires attention to sublexical units may tap these output representations that have a frontal localization. Spoken word production. Neuropsychological studies, as with word recognition, deficits in spoken word production could arise from several sources, depending on the affected stage of processing. See Figure 1. The types of errors patients produce in naming, e.g., picture naming or naming to definition, or other speech production tasks, oral reading, repetition, have been used as one source of data for identifying the low cause of damage. In naming, patients may produce predominantly semantically related words, e.g., parsley for carrot, e.g., Hodges et al. 1992, predominantly phonologically related words, e.g., golf for glove, blank in 1990, or predominantly phonologically related non-words, e.g., rind for bread, e.g., Kaplan et al. 1986, which might suggest disruptions at the semantic, lexical phonological, and sublexical phonological levels, respectively. Even though a certain type of error may predominate, most patients produce a mixture of error types. Dell et al. 1997 attempted to account for the different relative proportions of correct responses in different error types for fluent aphasic patients in terms of disruptions to all levels of an interactive activation model of word production initially derived to account for normal production. Dell and Oseda, 1992. As shown in Figure 2, the model includes semantic, lexical, and phonological levels and feed-forward and feedback connections between levels. Figure 2 Dell and Oseda, 1992, Model of Word Production. Anu. Reverend Cycall, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5, 2002. 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM latex 2E. January 18, 2002. P1 IBC. 64 Martin. In the first version of the model to be applied to patient data, Dell et al. 1997, global lesions were made that consisted of reducing connection strengths between all levels and increasing the decay rate at all levels, with changes in the two relevant parameters adjusted to fit individual patient data. Although this approach provided a relatively good fit to the error patterns of their patients, it did not account for patients who produced virtually all semantic errors, Kuramaza and Hillis 1990, Quatos et al. 2000, nor those who produced virtually all phonological errors, Kaplan et al. 1986, Kuramaza et al. 2000. Hoygel and Dell, 2000, proposed a revised model in which the globality assumption was abandoned and lesions were made separately to the connections between the semantic and lexical and between the lexical and phonemic levels. Although this approach provided a better fit to a response pattern of predominantly phonological errors and to word repetition data, the interactivity in the model still made it unable to fit a pattern of predominantly semantic errors, Rapp and Goldrick 2000, or one in which phonologically related non-word errors greatly outnumber phonologically related word errors, Kuramaza et al. 2000. Thus, the data strongly suggests that selective deficits can occur to different levels in the production process, but the details of models to account for such errors are debated with regard to the degree of interactivity between levels, Ruml et al. 2000, Rapp and Goldrick 2000. The approach of Dell and colleagues, Dell et al. 1997, Hoygel and Dell 2000, used the proportion of different error types in naming to identify the functional locus of damage. Clearly, other data may be brought to bear. Among patients producing predominantly semantic errors, some show a disruption of semantic knowledge on comprehension tests, e.g., Howard and Orchard-Lyle 1984, Hillis et al. 1990, Hodges et al. 1992, whereas others do not, e.g., Kuramaza and Hillis. 1990, Quatos et al. 2000. Thus, the former appear to have damage at the semantic level per se, whereas the latter have damaged beyond the semantic level, that is, in accessing phonological representations from semantic representations. Another relevant factor in determining the locus of damage is the patient's ability to repeat words and non-words. Some patients with preserved semantics but difficulty in accessing lexical phonology show preserved word and non-word repetition, e.g., Karamasa and Hillis 1990, Martin et al. 1999b, indicating that their deficit is not at the level of producing sublexical phonological segments. Patients who make phonologically related word or non-word errors in naming typically have difficulty with repetition as well, e.g., Karamasa et al. 1986, Kaplan et al. 1986, Bub et al. 1987, Shalais et al. 2000. These cases have sometimes been claimed to have a deficit in a phonological output buffer, that is, a short-term storage system for maintaining phonological information while articulatory programs are derived. Lesion localization for word production deficits has been addressed most often. With respect to the clinical category of anomic aphasia, which is characterized by pervasive word-finding impairments in spontaneous speech and naming in conjunction with intact repetition and fluent, grammatically correct speech, see Table 1, Example 3. Damasio and Damasio, 1989, Damasio et al. 1996, have reported that the lesions in anomic aphasia are outside the perisylvian region in anterior 4. Anu. Reverend Cycall, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5, 2002. 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM latex 2E, January 18, 2002, P1, IBC. Language and the brain 65. Inferior temporal regions. Semantic abilities and comprehension have not typically been extensively assessed for these patients, however, and thus it is difficult to know whether the word-finding difficulties derive from a semantic disruption or from a disruption of lexical phonological retrieval. Some evidence suggests that a left posterior temporal region, BA37, is crucial for the retrieval of phonological word forms in speech production, as patients with damage to this region have naming deficits even though they show preserved semantic knowledge. Raymer et al. 1997, Foundas et al. 1998, Hillis et al. 2001. Less attention has been devoted to the issue of lesion localization with regard to sublexical phonological deficits. All but one of the cases described above that were claimed to have deficits to the output phonological buffer had left hemisphere lesions affecting a number of temporoparietal regions, including cortical and underlying white matter. The remaining case had a similar lesion on the right. Thus, the evidence suggests posterior rather than anterior regions are involved in maintaining sublexical phonological representations. Neuroimaging studies in Dufresne Levels, 2000, reviewed 58 neuroimaging studies that used a variety of tasks involving speech production, e.g., picture nom-ing, word reading, non-word repetition. Based on these data, they argued that the left posterior middle and superior temporal gyri are involved in phonology cow word form retrieval, as this area was more activated in tasks involving word than non-word production. For sublexical phonological coding, no region strictly met their criterion for proportion of studies showing significant activation, but the regions coming closest were the left posterior inferior frontal gyrus and the left mid-superior temporal gyrus. In Dufresne Levels, 2000, identified regions that were active in overt speech tasks compared with silent controls and not active in covert speech tasks as areas involved in articulatory coding and execution. The areas satisfying this criterion were bilateral, aero pre and post-central gyri. Also, typically more active in overt than covert tasks were the left anterior superior temporal gyrus, the right supplementary motor area, and the left and medial cerebellum. A recent study by Wise et al., 2001, however, identified an area of the temporoparietal junction that showed greater activation with overt than covert articulation of a phrase. See also Buchsbaum et al. 2001. Independent or common lexical phonological representations. Neuropsychological studies. The model shown in Figure 1 has separate input and output lexical phonological representations. The Wernicke-Lichthien model assumed separate sensory and motor representations for words, though access to the sensory representation was needed to ensure access to the correct motor representation. There is currently considerable debate regarding whether independent input and output lexical representations are needed, Nichols et al. 1997, Martin et al. 1999b, or whether a single lexical phonological representation will suffice. Anu. Reverend Cycall, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5th, 2002, 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM Latex 2E, January 18, 2002, P1, IBC. 66 Martin. Hillis et al. 1999, Martin and Safran 2002. Schelice, 1988, argued that the semantic errors in single-word repetition, e.g., repeating woman as lady, that define the syndrome of deep dysphagia provide strong support for the independent lexicon's view. These semantic errors indicate that the word has been perceived, so their deficit cannot be in accessing a lexical phonological form on the input side. This phonological form should be the basis of repetition if the form is the same for perception and production. In terms of a two-lexicon model, this pattern can be accounted for by a disruption in direct connections between input and output phonological forms, with the result that translation between input and output involves access to a semantic representation. Martin and Safran, 1992, have argued, however, that this deep dysphasic pattern can be accounted for with a single lexicon model by assuming that, even though the correct phonological form is initially activated, the activation decays very rapidly and the patient has to use whatever semantic information has been activated to reconstruct the phonological form for output. See Howard and Franklin 1990 for evidence counter to the rapid decay account. Neuroimaging studies, although an early positron emission tomography study showed no activation of left posterior temporal areas in word production. Peterson et al. 1989. More recent studies have uncovered similar temporal regions involved in speech perception and production, in Dufresne and Level 2000. One might question whether exactly the same areas are involved. Anderson et al. 1999 found that intracranial cortical stimulation of the left superior temporal lobe caused significant phonological errors in production, but did not impair the patient's auditory word comprehension. However, Wise et al. 2001 found in a positron emission tomography imaging study that a region in the left posterior superior temporal sulcus that responded to words and perception was also activated during word production. It is possible that, in line with Wernicke's original hypothesis, there is a input phonological representation involved in both perception and production, and a separate output lexical representation involved only in production. According to such a view, it should be possible to find patients with normal word perception but impaired output, Romani 1992, Howard 1995, Martin et al. 1999b, but those showing impairments of lexical phonology on the input side should also show impaired output, Hillis et al. 1999. Semantic representations of words. Recent overviews by Shelton and Kuramaza, 1999, 2001, have summarized new rock psychological findings on the organization of semantic representations. They have dealt extensively with the nature of category-specific deficits, e.g., semantic deficits for living but not non-living things, concerning their underlying cause and possible neuroanatomical basis, but these are not dealt with here. See also Devlin et al. 2002. Considerable lesion data suggests that regions of the middle and inferior temporal lobe are involved in the representation of semantic knowledge. Droppers. Anu. Reverend Psychol, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5th, 2002. 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM Latex 2E, January 18, 2002, P1, IBC. Language and the Brain 67. Et al. 1995. Semantic dementia cases, i.e., patients whose primary symptom is a progressively severe disruption of semantic knowledge, have damage to the left, middle, and inferior temporal lobes that begins at the temporal pole and proceeds posteriorly as the condition progresses. Mummery et al. 2000. Mummery et al. also found that the degree of temporal damage predicted the degree of semantic disruption. Neuroimaging studies have also uncovered left, middle, and inferior temporal lobe activations during semantic processing, e.g., Vandenberg et al. 1996, Binder et al. 1997. The extent of right hemisphere involvement is unclear. Mummery et al. 2000 noted atrophy in the right temporal pole in most of their semantic dementia cases and suggested that bilateral damage was necessary for the most severe semantic deficits. A surprising outcome of neuroimaging studies has been that robust activations appear in left inferior frontal regions, BA 45 and 47, across numerous tasks such as categorization, semantic generation, concrete/abstract judgments, and judgments of semantic similarity. See Poldrack et al. 1999 for a review that can be differentiated from the more posterior frontal activations observed during phonological processing tasks, such as phoneme monitoring or rhyme judgments. Poldrack et al. 1999, Roskis et al. 2001, McDermott et al. 2002. These frontal activations are surprising in that patients with damage to these regions do not typically show severe semantic deficits, at least on single word processing tasks. The explanation offered for these findings is that whereas semantic knowledge may be stored posteriorly, these frontal areas serve as a semantic executive system involved in retrieving, storing, and manipulating these semantic representations. Roskis et al. 2001. Consistent with this claim are findings from patients with inferior frontal damage who show good semantic processing of single words, but a short-term memory. Deficit specific to the retention of semantic information. Bomani and Martin 1999. Friedman and Martin 2001. Grammatical representations of words. Word class affects words contain grammatical information as well as semantic and phonological information. For example, word class information, noun, verb, is needed in sentence comprehension and production for syntactic and formatting to be understood or produced correctly. Many studies have reported double dissociations in the production of different word classes, e.g., function words for SUS content words. Goodglass 1993, nouns versus verbs, e.g., Miseli et al. 1984, Zingser and Burt 1988, 1990, see Drucks 2002 for a review. For some patients, these apparent word class effects may have a semantic basis. For example, better production of nouns than verbs and better production of verbs than function words may occur because the patient is better able to produce more concrete words, e.g., Burt et al. 2002. For some patients, however, it appears that word class effects cannot be reduced to a semantic basis. Burnett et al. 2002, Rapp and Karamazov. 2002. Consequently, these deficits suggest that at some level in the production, system words are distinguished neurally with regard to the grammatical role they play in a sentence. Anu. Reverend Psychol, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5th, 2002. 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM Latex 2E, January 18, 2002, P1, IBC. 68 Martin. Some models of word production assume two levels of lexical representations, a semantic/syntactic representation, termed the lemma, and a phonological representation, termed the lexeme, with the lemma necessarily accessed prior to the lexeme. Garrett 1993, Levels et al. 1999. Taken as support for these two levels are findings from patients who in picture naming could correctly judge the grammatical gender of a target word, Badeker et al. 1995, or whether the word fits into count or mass phrasal context, Bigliacco et al. 1999, even though they were unable to read any of the phonemes in the word. Others researchers have argued that these findings can be accommodated in a model assuming a single lexical representation that is phonological and that connects to general syntactic proper ties for words, Karamazov and Miyato, 1997. The two positions appear difficult to distinguish on the basis of the available data, Nichols 2001. Morphological processing researchers have debated whether morphologically complex words, e.g., worked, teacher, undecided, are broken down into their separate morphemes in language production and comprehension, e.g., Allen and Badeker 1999, or whether they are treated as unitary words, e.g., Bybee 1988. Many aphasic patients produce inflectional errors in speech and oral reading, e.g., producing welds for welding or teaching for teacher, which would appear to support a decompositional view of morphological processing, Allen and Badeker 1999. Such apparently inflectional or derivational errors might be attributed, however, to whole word confusions based on phonological and semantic similarity, see Funnel 1987. Some findings argue against such an interpretation, Badeker and Karamazov 1991, Shapiro et al. 2000, Sapini et al. 2002. For instance, some of these patients make morphological errors only on words of one word class, that is either nouns, Shapiro et al. 2000, or verbs, Sapini et al. 2000, which would not be expected if the errors were due solely to semantic and phonological similarity of the error to the target. An issue that has recently attracted a great deal of debate is whether one or two systems are involved in computing past tense forms for regular versus irregular verbs. According to standard linguistic formulations, regular past tense forms in English, e.g., talked, gazed, needed, are computed by a rule that adds a past tense marker /d/to verbs, with the pronunciation depending on the final phoneme of the verb. Irregular past tense forms must be retrieved from memory, as the pronunciations are not predictable from the present tense forms, e.g. is, was, run, ran. Because novel words, i.e., pseudo-words such as flag or spuff, have no representation in memory, the regular rule should apply to these as well. In opposition to the dual systems view, some have argued that a single connectionist system supports computation of the past tense for regular and irregular forms and for novel forms, e.g., Rumelhart and McClelland, 1986. Ullman et al., 1997, presented evidence supporting the dual systems approach. Patient groups with posterior damage, posterior aphasia, Alzheimer's disease, had difficulty producing irregular but not regular past tense forms for real words and novel words, whereas patients with frontal or basal ganglia damage, i.e., anterior. Anning. Reverend Psychol, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5, 2002. 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM latex 2E, January 18, 2002, P1, IBC. Language and the Brain 69. Aphasics or Parkinson's patients show the reverse pattern. Ullman et al. Argued that these results were due to general properties of posterior versus frontal systems, in which posterior regions support declarative memory-based representations, whereas frontal/basal ganglia regions support procedural or rule-based knowledge. On the other side of the issue, Jonas and Seidenberg, 1999, and Patterson et al., 2001, have provided computational and empirical evidence for a single system approach. They argue that the observed double dissociation in the patient data derives from other factors, specifically semantic deficits in patients with post-rear damage, Patterson et al. 2001, and phonological deficits in patients with frontal damage, Patterson 2002. Tyler et al. 2002 argued, however, that a phonology cal deficit cannot account for anterior aphasics difficulty with regular forms, as the anterior aphasics they tested who showed worse performance on regular than irregular verb inflection performed quite well on various phoneme discrimination tasks. It should be noted that the plausibility of the claim that frontal brain regions support rule-based grammatical processing hinges in part on claims that anterior aphasics have difficulty with such processes in comprehension. As discussed in the next section, it is far from clear that this is the case. Sentence processing. Sentence comprehension. Dissociations among syntactic abilities, as mentioned in the introduction. Proposals from the 1970s and 1980s about a general syntactic deficit in Broca's aphasia were undermined by several lines of evidence. For one, the not infrequent co-occurrence of agrammatic speech and preserved syntactic comprehension, Burnt et al. 1996. In addition, several studies demonstrated that many patients who showed asyntactic comprehension on sentence picture matching did well on judging the grammatical acceptability of sentences. Linebarger et al. 1983, Schenkweiler et al. 1989, Wolfeck 1988. Included among the types of errors the patients could detect were the omission or substitution of function words and inflections, the elements most affected in their speech. Linebarger and colleagues, Linebarger et al. 1983, Linebarger 1990, Safran and Schwartz 1988, argued that these findings demonstrated a dissociation between two aspects of sentence level processing, determining the grammatical structure of the sentence and the math. Ping between grammatical and thematic roles, with only the latter being affected in these patients. That is, for example, these patients would be able to determine that the truck that the car splashed was green is a grammatical sentence, and that car is the grammatical subject, and truck the grammatical object of splashed. They would be unable to determine, however, that car should be mapped as the agent of splashed and truck as the theme, i.e., the entity acted upon. Thus, they would fail on all tasks requiring the interpretation of sentence meaning, such as sentence picture matching, enactment, acting out the action with toy objects. Anu. Reverend Psychol, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5, 2002. 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM latex 2E, January 18, 2002, P1, IBC. 70 Martin. Or sentence anomaly judgments, e.g., determining that the quarterback that the football threw was old was a nonsensical sentence. They would succeed if the task tapped only the determination of acceptable structure, even for sentences with complex structures, such as judging as ungrammatical a sentence like "the cake that the boy ate the pie was delicious," Linebarger 1990. Independence of semantic and syntactic representations, whereas in general agrammatic speakers do not provide the clearest evidence of a dissociation between the processing of syntax and semantics in comprehension. Some patients do provide such evidence. Ostrin and Tyler, 1995, reported a patient, J.G., who performed poorly on sentence picture matching when the distractor picture depicted a reversal of role relations, but performed well when the distractor included a lexical substitution. Unlike the patients reported by Linebarger et al., 1983, however, this patient performed poorly on grammaticality judgment tasks and showed no sensitivity to violations of grammatical structure in a word detection task. J.G. performed well on comprehension tests for single words and showed normal semantic priming. Although classified behaviorally as a Broca's aphasic, J.G.'s lesion was left temporoparietal. Some patients with Alzheimer's dementia demonstrate the opposite dyssocia. Tie-in of very impaired knowledge of word meanings, but preserved grammatical knowledge. For example, they might be unable to realize that a phrase such as "the Jeeps walked" is nonsensical, but yet be able to detect the grammatical error in a phrase like "the Jeeps goes." Hodges et al. 1994. Two semantic dementia patients have been reported who showed a remarkable ability to understand grammatical structure and appropriately assign thematic roles such as agent or theme to complex constructions like "it was the tiger that the lion bit," even though they could not distinguish the meaning of the nouns in the sentence. Schwartz and Chaloff 1990, Reedon and Safran 1999. Semantic dementia cases such as these typically have diffuse frontal and temporal damage, and their temporal lobe damage presumably underlies their inability to comprehend the nouns in the sentences. Mummery et al. 2000. It is difficult, though, to speculate about which preserved brain areas subserve their spared grammatical processing. Although the neuropsychological findings indicate that semantic and syntactic knowledge may be independently represented, findings from normal subjects indicate that during sentence processing the two sources of knowledge interact in determining sentence interpretation. Boland 1997, Truswell et al. 1994. Some patient data are consistent with this conclusion. Safran et al. 1998 showed that some patients may use the grammatical structure of sentences during comprehension when there are weak semantic constraints, e.g., understanding that "boy" is the agent of "pushed" in "the boy that the girl pushed," but fail to use the grammatical structure when there are strong semantic constraints, e.g., mistakenly interpreting the woman as the agent of "spanked" in "the woman that the child spanked." See also Tyler 1989. Anu. Reverend Psychol, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5, 2002, 1522 AR 178 PS54-03.text AR 178 PS54-03.SGM LaTeX 2E, January 18, 2002, P1, IBC. Language and the Brain 71. Working memory and sentence comprehension theories of comprehension often assume a role for a short-term or working memory system that is used to hold partial results of comprehension processes while the rest of a sentence is processed and integrated with earlier parts, e.g., Justin Carpenter, 1992. Aphasic patients often have very restricted short-term memory spans, typically being able to recall only 2 or 3 words from a list, compared with normal subjects' 5 or 6 words, Dorenzi and Nicelli, 1975. Studies with normal subjects indicate that comprehension becomes more difficult when the working memory demands a sentence processing increase. Justin Carpenter 1992, Gibson 1998. Thus, one might hypothesize that patients' restricted memory span is the source of observed sentence comprehension difficulties. However, a number of studies have shown that patients with very restricted memory spans may show excellent sentence calm. Prehension even for sentences with complex syntactic structures, Butterworth et al. 1986, Kaplan and Waters 1999, Hanton and Martin 2001, Waters et al. 1991. Kaplan and Waters, 1999, see also Kaplan and Hildebrandt 1988, have interpreted such findings to indicate that there is a working memory capacity specific to sentence processing that is different from that tapped by span tasks. They divide the procedures involved in sentence processing into interpretive and post-interpretive processes. Interpretive processes include all online syntactic and semantic processes, including those involved in semantic interpretation based on the ongoing discourse. Post-interpretive processes involve using the products of interpretive processing to carry out some task, such as sentence picture matching or enactment of the action in the sentence. Based on a large number of findings with normal and brain-damaged subjects, Kaplan and Waters argue that interpretive processing draws on the capacity specific to sentence processing, whereas post-interpretive processing draws on the capacity tapped by span tasks. Martin and colleagues, Hanton and Martin 2000, Martin et al. 1994, 1999b, Martin and Romani 1994, have provided a different view on the relation between the capacities involved in span tasks and sentence processing. They argue that span tasks tap both phonological and semantic retention. See also Martin and Safran 1997. The phonological component of span tasks is independent of the capacity involved in sentence processing, as patients with difficulty retaining phonological information may show preserved sentence comprehension. However, the semantic component does play a role in sentence comprehension in the maintenance of word meanings prior to their integration with other word meanings. Specifically, patients with a semantic retention deficit had difficulty detecting the semantic anomaly in sentences with several adjectives preceding a noun, e.g., the rusty old red swimsuit, or with several nouns preceding a verb, e.g., rocks, trees, and shrubs grew in the backyard, but did better when the adjectives followed the noun or the nouns followed the verb. Martin and colleagues agree with Kaplan and Waters, 1999, to some extent, as they argue that the retention of specifically syntactic structural information is independent of both phonological and semantic capacities. Martin and Romani, 1994. Anu. Reverend Cycall, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5, 2002. 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM latex 2E, January 18, 2002, P1, IBC. 72 Martin. Neuroanatomical basis of sentence comprehension. Lesion studies. Although many studies investigating syntactic comprehension deficits have focused on Broca's aphasics, several studies have demonstrated a similar pattern of increasing comprehension difficulty with increasing syntactic complexity for patients falling into other syndrome categories or having lesions restricted to posterior regions. Naser et al. 1987. Kaplan and Hildebrandt 1988. Kaplan et al. 1996. Dronkers et al. 1994 found that among Broca's aphasics, those who had lesions affecting a portion of the left anterior temporal lobe had difficulty computing sentence meaning based on syntactic information, whereas those with a lesion restricted to Broca's area did not. Dronkers and Larson, 2001, state, however, that lesions restricted to this temporal lobe region did not result in this comprehension deficit. Moreover, some of the patients in the Kaplan et al. 1996 study who had syntactic comprehension deficits did not have lesions AF affecting this region. Several researchers have suggested that a complex system of brain regions underlies syntactic aspects of comprehension. Kaplan et al. 1996. Dronkers and Larson 2001, Dick et al. 2001, and that the degree of damage to the overall system predicts the degree of comprehension deficit. Although this may be the case, there are many aspects to syntactic processing, e.g., the assignment of hierarchical structure, the assignment of thematic roles, the processing of long-distance relations, the maintenance of working memory representations, and the failure of any of these could lead to difficulty with more complex constructions. Martin 1995. Individual cases need to be studied in enough detail to specify the nature of the deficit in order to determine if subcomponents of syntactic processing map onto more precise brain regions. Neuroimaging studies. As with the lesion data, there is no clear-cut conclusion emerging from neuroimaging studies regarding the brain regions underlying syntactic processing. The patient data implies that different brain regions are involved in determining syntactic structure and using that structure to assign thematic roles. Neuroimaging studies have typically employed tasks that emphasize one or the other, but without consideration of the implications of these methodological differences. Another methodological variation is the use of passive listening versus active tasks, with the attendant concerns, as in the word comprehension literature, of whether the passive tasks do not sufficiently engage the subject to reveal activa time of all critical brain regions and whether the active tasks introduce activation specific to task demands. One approach to isolating syntactic from semantic processing has been to use sentence materials in which content words have been replaced with pseudo-words, e.g., the Blythe symbol on the plinth, or, less often, with semantically anomalous words, e.g., the kitchen's march on the clouds. In a passive listening study, Mazalier et al., 1993, found that the temporal poles were activated bilaterally in their normal prose and syntactic conditions, which employed both of these manipulations, but not in their wordless condition. Two recent studies. Anu. Reverend Cycall, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreview.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5th, 2002. 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM latex 2E. January 18, 2002. P1 IBC. Language and the Brain 73. Involving active processing of sentences with pseudowords required judgments of whether the stimuli had syntactic structure, Friederisi et al. 2000, or were grammatically acceptable, Morrow et al. 2001. Both studies found deep inferior frontal activation bilaterally for the pseudoword relative to control conditions. Importantly, however, Friederisi et al. Did not find such frontal activation when subjects made the same judgment about normal sentences. It is possible that the frontal activations with pseudoword stimuli derived from the difficulty in maintaining these stimuli in short-term memory long enough to extract grammatical information. Another approach to isolating syntactic processing has been to use sentences with semantically appropriate words in active tasks that stress either syntactic processing, e.g., grammaticality judgments, or semantic processing, e.g., semantic acceptability. Two studies taking this approach failed to find regions that were selectively activated by their syntactic conditions, NI et al. 2000, Cooperberg et al. 2000, though both found regions selectively activated by their semantic conditions. Of course, one might argue that the semantic conditions necessarily engage syntactic processing, and thus subtracting the semantic from the syntactic conditions takes out activation owing to syntactic processing. DePreto and Bruckheimer, 1999, took a somewhat similar approach and found greater activation in Broca's area, left VA 44, for their syntactic condition and greater activation in a more anterior frontal region, left VA 47, in their semantic condition. This study, unlike the other two, required the determination of sentence meaning in the syntactic condition, e.g., determining that the teacher was outsmarted by the student meant the same as the student outsmarted the teacher. A third approach has been to determine the brain regions that show greater activation with increasing syntactic complexity of the stimuli. In a passive listening study, Stowe et al., 1998, found that the left posterior and middle temporal gyrus showed increasing activation with more complex structures. Their study did not, however, control for the specific words in the sentences and sentence length in the different conditions. Other studies have used active tasks in which subjects judge semantic acceptability or answer comprehension questions for different sentence types that are closely matched in length and content words, but vary in syntactic complexity. Structures such as the following have been compared. 1. Center-embedded subject-relative. The child that spilled the juice stained the rug. 2. Center-embedded object-relative. The juice that the child spilled stained the rug. Numerous studies with normal subjects have demonstrated that the object-relative structure is more difficult than the subject-relative structure and that a contributing factor is the memory demand in the object-relative form involved in reactivating the head noun following the embedded clause verb, e.g., juice following spilled, after having processed the embedded clause subject, e.g., child. See Gibson 1998 for discussion. Anu. Reverend Cycall, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5th, 2002. 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM latex 2E. January 18, 2002. P1 IBC. 74 Martin. Taking this approach, Just et al., 1996, found that activation increased with increasing sentence difficulty in the left inferior frontal gyrus and the left middle and superior temporal gyri. Homologous areas on the right also showed increasing activation, but the overall level of activation was smaller. In contrast, Stromswold et al., 1996, found that only a region within Broca's area was more active for their more complex structure. Kaplan et al., 1998, replicated this finding of greater activation in, or near, Broca's area, but also showed greater activation for the more complex structures in the left medial frontal area and in the cingulate. More recently, Kaplan, 2001, reported some additional replications, but also some failures to replicate activation in Broca's area in studies using similar sentence contrasts. In one study using elderly subjects and another using young subjects matched in education to the elderly subjects, activation was obtained in parietal and superior frontal areas, though the exact locations were different for the two groups. In an event-related design using young subjects, Kaplan et al., 2001, uncovered activation in the angular gyrus and a superior temporal region. Kaplan et al. Have suggested that one possible source of this variation across studies is the varying syntactic proficiencies of their subjects and the varying difficulty of the tasks assigned to subjects, i.e., whole sentence reading versus word-by-word reading. It is perhaps premature to draw general conclusions about the brain regions underlying syntactic processing until a better understanding has been obtained about the effects of different tasks, different types of materials, different pre-syntactile modes, and different subject groups. It is the case, however, that inferior frontal activation has been observed in Brodmann's areas, the ACE, 44 and 45, across several studies, though not all, that have required subjects to compute a meaning. Representation for complex structures. To interpret this activation, one has to keep in mind that patients with damage to this region do not typically have difficulty with grammaticality judgments. Thus, this region should not be interpreted as one involved in assigning syntactic structure to a sentence. Instead, this region may be involved in semantic working memory functions such as those related to reactivating a semantic representation for an earlier occurring noun that has to be linked to a later occurring position in a sentence, as in the object-relative constructions. See Kaplan et al. 1998, Stowe et al. 1998 for related discussion. Such an effect related to semantic retrieval and manipulation would be consistent with findings showing activation in this region for various types of semantic processing tasks. Holdrak et al. 1999. Sentence production. Patterns of sentence production deficits in aphasia, challenges to traditional claims. Sentence production deficits have also been a focus of research in aphasia, although in this domain much of the work originated from a syndrome-based approach, concentrating on Broca's aphasics who produce agrammatic speech, that is, speech. Anu. Reverend Psychol, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5, 2002. 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM LaTeX 2E, January 18, 2002, P1, IBC. Language and the Brain 75. Marked by simplified grammatical form and the omission of function words and inflections. Fluent speakers are said to produce paragrammatic speech, which is characterized by the substitution of inappropriate function words and inflectional morphemes rather than their omission. Some researchers attributed these differences to a syntactic deficit in Broca's aphasics and a word retrieval deficit in fluent speakers that affects both content and function words. See Burt 2001 for discussion. As in the study of comprehension, more recent findings have challenged these claims concerning the differences between non-fluent and fluent speakers. Cross-linguistic studies of aphasia suggest that Broca's aphasics tend to produce a default form of a verb, which in English tends to be an infinitive form, i.e., without inflection, whereas in other languages this will be an inflected form, Men 2001. Wernicke's aphasics also tend to overproduce verb forms that occur frequently in their native language, but produce a wider range of options. Both omissions and substitutions of function words have been documented in detailed analyses of agrammatic, Miceli et al. 1989, and paragrammatic, Butterworth and Howard 1987, speech, see also Harmon and Koch 1992. Both non-fluent and fluent speakers show reduced structural complexity, with the deficit taking similar forms across the two groups, Bird and Franklin 1996. Moreover, sentence structure and function word difficulties have been found to dissociate, arguing against the claims that both derive from the same syntactic deficit. Some patients demonstrate reduced sentence complexity but accurate production of function words and inflections, Bird and Franklin 1995/1996, Safran et al. 1989, whereas others show the reverse, Miceli et al. 1983, Koch et al. 1985, Nispoulis et al. 1988, Nadeau and Brophy 1992. A patient reported by Thompson et al. 2002 showed a particularly striking dissociation in this regard, as she pro. Duché complex syntactic structures as often as normal subjects, but made many errors in the production of inflectional morphemes, though she was able to probe Duché function words appropriately. As this indicates, the relative proportion of function words versus inflectional errors can vary substantially across patients, as can other properties of these errors such as the proportion of omissions for SUS substitutions and the relative difficulty with different kinds of function words, e.g., determiners versus auxiliary verbs, Miceli et al. 1989. Theoretical accounts of sentence production disorders, these similar idioms in grammatical deficits across syndromes and variations within syndromes imply that, as in the study of comprehension, A more fruitful approach than group comparisons would be the study of individual cases with respect to their implications for theory. Figure 3 shows a standard model of language production. The model was presented by Bach and Level, 1994, and represents a somewhat modified version of a theory initially proposed by Garrett, 1980. At the top level is a non-linguistic representation of the message to be expressed. At the next level, lexical semantic forms are accessed and the functional relations among them are spelled out, e.g., grammatical roles of nouns with respect to verb, modification relations between adjectives and nouns. At the next level, syntactic. Anu. Reverend Cycall, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5, 2002. 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM LaTeX 2E. January 18, 2002. P1 IBC. 76 Martin. Figure 3 Bach and Levels, 1994, model of sentence production. Frames are chosen to express the functional relations, and lexical phonological forms are inserted into the frame. At this point, a linear ordering of the words is developed, and function words and grammatical markers are inserted at 8 appropriate points. At the next stage, the phonetic representation of the utterance is specified. As the model postulates two levels of grammatical representation, the functional and positional levels, one might hypothesize that patients with grammatical deficits in production could have selective damage to one of these two components. At each level, however, there are various representations and processes involved, and thus, different types of deficits might appear from damage to the same level. At the functional level, one major component involves mapping of the relations between the verbs and nouns that play thematic roles with respect to the verb, Bach and Level, 1994. The specific verb to be used dictates what grammatical. Anu. Reverend Cycall, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5, 2002. 1522 AR 178 PS 54-03.text AR 178 PS 54-03.SGM LaTeX 2E. January 18, 2002. P1 IBC. Language and the Brain 77. Role a noun with a specific thematic role will play, e.g., the recipient will be the subject of an active sentence using the verb receive, but indirect object of an active sentence using give. A deficit in knowledge of the relations of thematic and grammatical roles entailed by verbs could potentially lead to an incomplete specification at the functional level and a reduction in sentence structure, such as the failure to produce a required indirect object. Safran et al. 1980. Berndt et al. 1997. Found some support for this notion in a study of 10 patients who varied in their relative ability to produce nouns and verbs in single-word tasks. They found a strong relation between greater difficulty with verbs than nouns and impairments on structural measures of spontaneous speech, such as mean sentence length, sentence elaboration with content words, and proportion of words in sentences. 2 of the 5 verb-impaired patients showed a much greater proportion of grammatically acceptable sentences and greater production of the object noun. When asked to generate a sentence using an experimenter-provided verb compared with a noun. Another type of production deficit has also been attributed to a disruption at the functional level. Martin and Blossenstock, 1986, and Kurmaza and Miceli, 1991, reported case studies of patients who produced appropriate nouns and verbs, but often reversed the roles of the nouns with respect to the verb, e.g., saying the boy was pushed by the girl for a picture of a boy pushing a girl. They argued that these patients had difficulty with the mapping between thematic roles and grammatical roles at the functional level, i.e., they had a mapping deficit on the production side. Interestingly, these patients produced otherwise grammatically correct utterances, indicating that the other stages in the production process were executed appropriately. Also, both patients showed similar mapping deficits in comprehension, suggesting that a central process subserves the mapping between grammatical and thematic roles in both production and comprehension. Whereas these patients showed a general mapping deficit, other patients have demonstrated difficulties that appear limited to certain verbs, specifically those for which there exists a closely related verb with different mapping relations, e.g., give-take, Feisel, Breeden and Martin 1996, Bing 1988. A disruption at the positional level could also take different forms. Difficulty with accessing syntactic frames could be another possible locus of reduced structural complexity, Goodblatt et al. 1994, as patients might be able to access only the simplest, most frequent structural frames, Stemberger 1984. Also, Garrett, 1980, claimed that function words and inflectional markers are part of the syntactic frame. If so, difficulty with accessing frames would lead to errors involving such elements. Karmazza and Hillis, 1989, endorsed Garrett's approach in their interpretation of findings from a patient who omitted function words and inflect. Tie-ins on sentence production tasks, but who had no difficulty with functions words. On single word tasks. They pointed out, however, that Garrett's model is underspecified with regard to accounting for aspects of their patient's behavior, e.g., the greater proportion of omissions of function words than inflections, and the varia tie-in in substitutions versus omissions of function words across different patients. Anu. Reverend Cycall, 2003.54:55-89. Downloaded from www.annualreviews.org. Access provided by Howard University on July 26, 19. For personal use only. December 5th, 2002, 1522 AR 178 PS54-03.text AR 178 PS54-03.SGM Latex 2E, January 18, 2002, P1, IBC. 78 Martin. Other theorists have argued that grammatical elements are retrieved in the same fashion as content words, Bach 1989. If so, some other means of explaining disorders of function words and inflectional markers would have to be proposed. Various hypotheses have been advocated: A disruption of function words and grammatical markers per se, which constitute a specialized word class, Bradley et al. 1980. B a syntactic deficit that prevents determination of the correct function word or inflection to express grammatical relations, Thompson et al. 2002. C a deficit in accessing all low imageability words, Bird et al. 2002. D a phonological disturbance that affects late stages of the production process, during which the phonological forms of function words and inflections are determined, Safran et al. 1980. Of course, these hypotheses would not have to be mutually exclusive, that is, the different patterns of function word deficits for different patients may have different underlying causes. Working memory deficits in production. Although the role of working MEM-ORI in comprehension has been studied extensively, relatively little attention has been paid to its role in production. A model like that in Figure 3 would imply that working memory capacities of various types are involved, as the representations for several words would have to be activated and maintained simultaneously at different stages in the process. This maintenance would have to persist long enough for the processes at the next stage to be carried out. Koch, 1995, has hypothesized that aphasic language production patterns derive from a disruption of temporal coordination during syntactic planning. He proposes that at the positional level, both content words and function words are inserted into a syntactic frame. Difficulties arise owing to slow activation or overly rapid decay of some elements that should be expressed in the same syntactic unit. The more complex the syntactic structure, the more elements to be realized and the more likely some temporal mismatch will occur between elements. Patients can adapt to this deficit by either using simpler structures or sticking with more complex structures, but omitting some elements. In support of this view, Koch and his colleagues have shown that patients' production patterns can appear quite different under different task demands. Koch and Heshin, 1992, Hofstede and Koch, 1994. Martin and Friedman, 2001, presented evidence that a semantic short-term MEM-ORI limitation can affect patients' productions. Patients with a semantic retention deficit, but not those with a phonological retention deficit, had difficulty product ing adjective noun phrases, e.g., small leaf, or short dark hair, although they were able to produce the individual adjectives and nouns in isolation. They argued that subjects plan speech in a phrase-by-phrase fashion, planning the